I want you to get something practical out of today. So how many of you have parents who are possibly collecting Social Security or making that decision? Anyone? Okay, here's the lesson. If they have any money at all, they should delay claiming. You can leave now. But that's essentially, and we'll talk more because it's more complicated than that, but that's the decision I'm going to be talking about today, when to claim your Social Security benefits. This is part of a long set of research. We've been lucky enough to be funded by the NSF, the National Institute of Aging, and Social Security Administration, also TIA CREF Foundation, to look at this. I want to talk today about zoom in on one particular topic, and that is when you should retire, or actually when should you start claiming benefits. Okay. So this is actually the form that you get when you turn, I'm embarrassed to say this, but I'm getting the form. When you turn 58 or so, you start getting this form. And it says, here's the decision you're going to face, here's the amount you can collect, and here is how that changes over time. A couple things about that. You can claim any time between 62 and 70. The longer claiming is delayed, the larger the monthly benefit. The benefits are frozen at that point. They don't go up, except for cost of living increases. Okay, so basically you're making a choice about what your monthly payment will be by deciding when you're going to retire. Interesting thing about that is it really turns out to be a very important decision for people for a couple of reasons. First, let me skip to sort of the bottom line. The median retirement savings of an American household is $75,000. Does that surprise you? It surprised me a lot. Median, which means half the population has less. So they're going to retire over a period of 18 years. You can do a lot of math, but that turns out to be they've saved about the equivalent of $250 a month. So they're not going to be living off their savings. A large part of Americans are going to be living off their Social Security benefits. So this is, for them, an important decision. That's one of the reasons we've been interested in studying it. A couple other stylized facts. 44% of people first think about the retirement decision the year before they retire. They actually claim, if you ask them in a survey, when did you start thinking about the year you would retire? And they said, a year ago. That's also depressing. And one context here, which might be interesting, if any of you sort of know the consumer finance literature, there's a model that says people are optimizing across their entire lifetime. This isn't going to fit that very well. So let me just acknowledge that to begin with. So this is an important decision for about half of all Americans. It's going to be their primary source of income. So what's interesting is when people actually choose to start collecting benefits. And the answer is almost half of them at 62, as soon as possible. Now this is, perhaps for some people, a mistake. What are some of the things they could do instead of this? Well, if they had more retirement savings, they could consume that and wait to collect benefits when the benefits would be larger. Another thing that's true is if I'm a couple, this is often in a traditional family, the husband who makes the decision. What is the one thing we know about husbands versus wives? The husband's not going to live as long as the wife. And her benefits will be determined by when he starts claiming. So people at Social Security are very concerned because what happens is, so it's bad for him because he's collecting less money. But it's even worse for her because she's both younger and going to live longer. Everyone understand why this is sort of a problem? So we first got into this in part because it's a great problem for a theoretical perspective, but also a practical problem. Okay, so what's the theory here? What's the story? Now, please don't pull out Excel. You're tempted to, because I'm going to ask you an intertemporal choice, and you're going to say, I can do the net present value. Don't do that. This is the kind of choice we actually give people in a whole nother research program that does intertemporal choice between time, actually, while we do fMRI in a scanner. We're not going to talk about that today, but we give people this choice, and some of them actually get the choice between a $51.30 today Amazon gift certificate or $56.40 in 4 weeks. What would you pick? This. Go ahead. How many people would pick this? You guys all are doing net present value, weren't you? The interest rate here is roughly 118%. When you talk to, I'm kidding you when I say this, normal people, about 70 or 80% will pick this, which is really amazing, right? Now, what happens if we do one small change to that choice? Now, notice what we've done here. Do you see? We just added 2 weeks to each outcome. Right? Now, most people will shift to the later, larger outcome. They'll pick the bigger gift certificate. Now, this is fundamentally one of the departures between behavioral economics and the economics that is used for normative models, particularly in finance. And it shows something that there's something about this. Let's see if I can do backwards. There we go. There's something about this being available today that gives it extra value. The term that behavioral economists use for this is present bias. Things that are available now get more weight or more likely to be chosen. One way to think about this is think about there's maybe utility for having a beer on Thursday night. And you can say Monday, no, the utility I'm going to get from studying on Friday and Thursday night's higher. Tuesday, the utility I'm going to get Thursday is higher. Wednesday, the utility I get is higher. But when that beer is sitting you in the face, someone says, do you want a beer? Now it's now. And if there's present bias, you're going to say yes, and you'll get this reversal, right? Because it's now, not in the future. There's lots of cases where that happens. My favorite occurs most every morning when I set my alarm for 6 o'clock, saying we can get up and run. And what is the thing that's now? The pain of getting out of bed. And that gets overweighted. So we're wondering if, in fact, what's happening here is exactly a phenomenon that's like that. That basically claiming it early leads to reduced monthly benefits, but it's now, so it seems more attractive. Claiming later leads to greater monthly benefits, but it's later, so it's discounted. And claiming then is a choice, a classic choice between a smaller, sooner reward and a larger, later reward. This, by the way, work was sort of pioneered by a faculty member who's now in our psychology department named Walter Mischel. And if you ever heard about the marshmallow test, anyone here ever hear about this? This is where work like this began. In fact, I would argue, and this is just me, but I would argue if you graduate from Columbia without knowing about present bias and hyperbolic discounting, we're doing you a disservice, because this is how people really behave. Okay, strong statement, but I think true. One of the interesting things is, just in my example with the beer, or sleeping in instead of exercising, we expect preference reversals. That is, someone's going to be 45 and say, yeah, I'm going to retire at 70. Someone will be 55 saying, I'm going to retire at 70. But when they get 62, they're saying, you know, it sounds really good to start collecting money tomorrow. This present bias will kick in, and they'll reverse their preferences. So I'm going to tell you about a bunch of studies. And the idea we're going to use to motivate this is that basically people actually construct or generate a set of answers to these questions. It's going to be something like this. I could ask myself, should I retire now? Or should I retire? And that you decompose into two questions. Why would I retire early, or why retire later? Okay, there's essentially an argument with yourself. The way most people think about this is exactly asking themselves the first question, and that means for reasons that are deeply psychological, the first question I ask myself will get a lot more attention. I'll retrieve from memory a lot more things. Notice this isn't like there's a utility function ahead. I'm making up on the spot my response. So we think what happens is the reasons to retire early will be more available, more accessible, overweighted. The reasons for retiring late will be underweighted, and that's what's going to cause this tendency to pick the 62 as a retirement age. And in fact, if we could change that, we might even be able to get people to say they will retire later. Okay, so that's the goal. Any questions? I know I shouldn't be waiting for questions, but please.
So I have a question. I understand the whole present bias, but is there also maybe a thing that people who expect to live shorter
right.
do pick earlier?
Okay, let me hold, that's an excellent point. And one of the things here I'm going to have to say is I don't know who's making a mistake. Right? In the aggregate, there are people, that 48% of people, who should be retiring early, and for at least two reasons. One reason is they're not going to live very long. So if I'm 62 and I'm going to live to 65, go for it. Retire as early, claim benefits as early as possible. There are other factors too, like what are your options? If you hate your job and love your life outside of work, it's much more appealing to start collecting benefits. So an important point here, which is going to be fundamental, is I don't know who's going to be making the mistake. So simple interventions that just makes everybody wait might actually be dangerous for exactly the reasons you're pointing out. So this slide was essentially, it's a complicated decision, there are firms, MetLife is one, that have calculators that tell you when you should do this. It's actually not a simple problem. You have to say, how old are you? They ask you how healthy you are. They try and estimate, essentially, how long you'll live so they can help you make this choice. And we're not going to do that, but we're going to do a set of studies that will eventually, we hope, get us to the point of not only delaying people, but delaying the right people. Okay, I'm just going to give you the setup for the first study because it's typical of everything I'm going to talk about. We had in this study more subjects than usual, 1,292 participants. These are real people. They're not even Amazon Mechanical Turks. They are actually people who do surveys for market research companies. We're paying them a substantial amount of money for them, $3 or $4 to do this study. All of them will be eligible or expecting to become eligible for Social Security. And what I want to draw your attention is their average family income is at or below the US median. So these are people who will be relying on Social Security. We actually asked them to type aloud before they make their decision, so we can get some idea of what their thoughts are. I'm not going to talk about that much, but the idea here is very simple. We'd like to know what's going through people's heads, and we can't actually scan everybody, which is something we would do for the 40 people we can afford to do uptown in the medical school. Here, when we have 1,200 people, we have them actually say, what are the reasons you're going to retire early or late? The thought here is very simple, is if I'm retiring early because I think about those things first, I should type about them first. Okay, here we just ask them, given your situation, when would you retire? And here are the results, and this just goes to show you. The dark blue lines are essentially those people who are not yet eligible. Only 25% of them think they're going to retire at 62. The light blue lines are those who are now eligible, and notice, that jumps up. We said it's 48% in the real world. This is going to be about 42%. Notice that's the reversal we're talking about. People say, I'm going to wait, I'm going to wait, I'm going to wait. Now I'm eligible, I'm going to retire early. Okay, so we see that. And that's a big part of the action that we see. And we see the other part is when people who are not yet eligible all say they're going to wait to 70, that figure is dropped in half when they're actually eligible. So that it's consistent with, but it's not proof of present bias. We actually do a bunch of regressions. This is the only regression slide I'll show you. A bunch of regressions trying to predict the age. And some of the things are things exactly what we'd expect, like how long do you think you're going to live? How healthy are you? Whether or not you have a retirement plan. They all go in the right direction. So it looks like people are taking this question seriously. It goes the right way. But when we add how often they thoughts about retiring early, that turns out to be a huge, in fact, the single biggest predictor. In fact, it accounts for more variance than all the other things combined, which suggests that this might be something we want to play with. That if we get people to think differently, we can get them to behave differently. Okay. Now, part of the reason we're doing this is part of a broad interest that we and a lot of psychologists have now in choice architecture, which is the idea that how I frame questions to people can change what they choose. An important idea, which I won't talk a lot about today, is basically, are you doing that in people's self-interest or not? I'm just going to say, let's assume there are some people making mistakes. Can we get people, at first, as a whole, to delay? Then, later on, and I'll be honest with you, we're analyzing this data now, can we get the right people to delay? Okay. And basically what we're going to say is, we're going to try a bunch of things. By the way, the Simpson-Bowles Commission actually had an explicit call for behavioral economists, and I should add, and psychologists, to look at this problem. So here's the standard way that problem is framed. We said, gee, part of what's going on here is people aren't realizing they're giving up money. They're leaving money on the table by retiring early. So we took the standard Social Security form and just changed it so that you actually could see this is below what you would get if you waited till what actually the Social Security Administration calls the full retirement age. That in of itself is sort of a target for people. Turns out not to be a very effective target, but that's what we did. So this essentially is our first attempt. We also wanted, I presented this at a conference, I won't tell you the results quite yet, but I was going to say, how about if you've got a really strong visual manipulation? This looks like something a bureaucrat would come up with. So we came up with this thing on the left. I called the previous one the mild intervention. This would be, therefore, the wild intervention. And here, the losses are explicit. You're giving up from $1,000 a month to $250. They're in red, so you can see this. And we thought this would actually perhaps make a difference. In another study, we did something else, which is we said, if you're right that people are asking themselves questions about why they should retire now versus later, maybe you could do well by having them reverse the natural order. When you're 62, you're going to say, gee, it's really good. I can retire tomorrow. I won't go to work. It will feel so good. What's hard to do is saying, how would it feel to be 70 and have $500 more in my monthly check? So what we do there is something very simple. We ask people to essentially do our thought listing exercise we did in the first study, but we're actually changing the order. So half the people will be asked your thoughts about receiving retirement benefits later. And we think that's unnatural. That's very different from what people actually do. And that should, in fact, delay retirement. Okay, of course, we're going to do half the people get the other order, so we'll see what they do as well. And that contrast, simply listing thoughts in different orders, might have an influence. Okay, please.
Are you tracking them to see what they actually do?
We actually will, well, so in these studies, these are all hypothetical. The last slide will be, as you can imagine, it won't be a trivial exercise to get, who poses these questions? The Social Security Administration. So when I come back to the end, I'll talk about steps. But one of the things about these kinds of studies is, you might say, well, they're hypothetical, but notice we can experiment with different interventions and find out which ones are most effective before we do the field study. So I think that's really one of the lessons I've actually been trying to teach in my time in Washington, that these kind of studies help you hone in on what's the best. Okay. The last thing we're going to do is look. I know that if we ever got a three-lettered administration in Washington that takes care of people's retirement packages to do this, they're not going to have them do a thought listing. But we came up with something I sort of think, frankly, is kind of clever, which I might call a preference checklist. We took the thoughts that people told us and got some common ones, things that people often thought about for early and late, and just said, by the way, before you make this choice, tell us whether does this thought or one very similar cross your mind while making the decision about when to begin claiming benefits? Yes, no, I don't know. And so one of the things people often say when we look at their reasons early is they don't want to have to work until I'm old. I want to enjoy some non-work time with friends and family. So our response said, yes, no, I don't know. And they had 4 of these that were for retiring early. My family does not have a history of living long, so I don't expect to live a long time either. Yes, no, maybe. Instead of waiting until 7 years old to get the highest benefits, it's best to claim early and invest the money. This is the stupidest reason I'm going to tell you. Why? Essentially, if you wait, you're getting the equivalent of an 8% risk-free rate of return. Unless you think you're a magical investor, that's a pretty good deal. So we give people this because lots of people think this is what they should do. It turns out, I want to make sure you realize that's probably not a wise thing. And we do things like, I don't like my job anymore, so claiming benefits now would let me leave a bad situation. Okay. Now, the late ones are actually interesting. Some of them are mirror images, but this is great. Since people usually need more money to spend on medical bills as they get older, I'll delay claiming as long as possible. That way I'll have more money when I probably will need it the most. People tell us when we do qualitative research, this is something they don't think of at 62. It's something, when it's pointed out to them, they say, yeah, I really should be thinking about that. Et cetera, et cetera. The only thing we do in that study is we give them one checklist first, then the other. So everyone is seeing the same facts, which just change the order. If this notion of query theory is right, what's going to happen? Well, when I see the reasons late first, I'm going to retire later. So I'm not going to give you a lot of results. I'm just going to show you what works. I'll start by looking at months relative control. I want to start out with this. This isn't our experiment, neither is this. But this experiment was done accidentally by the Social Security Administration. Until 2009, they would calculate for everybody their break-even age. What is the age when, if they started claiming at 62 versus 65, that they would break even? That is, when would the additional benefits from waiting at 65 make up for the money they lost by claiming at 62? Now, I would argue this is probably incredibly relevant, unless the day you break even, you're sort of doing a little sack and saying, yay, I beat the government. What you really want to look at is basically how the money makes you feel. It turns out, though, doing that break-even age lowered people's retirement decisions by 15 months. They did not know this. This is a good example of bad choice architecture done accidentally. When they finally did some studies, they stopped calculating the break-even age. A great paper by some economists actually changed the language in the form to losses. So if you retire at 62, you give up. It sort of was the verbal equivalent of our form. That was their best intervention. That delayed retirement about 3 months. That's Brown, Capitan, and Olivia Mitchell. Our picture with the nice little red, the nice green bars only, delayed retirement about the same amount. Our wild intervention, that didn't do anything. That's not significantly different than zero. So I think we tested, people understood it, but I don't know if they didn't believe it. I don't quite went on there, but a good idea gone bad. Now, our manipulation, we asked people to type out reasons later before reasons first. That delayed things about 9 months. That was pretty remarkable. And notice, by the way, this is not something that has anything to do with economic incentives. It has to do with what people are thinking. And finally, our checklist, we were actually pretty hopeful for. It might be about as good and possibly something you could implement. And that actually delays about 8.4 months, almost as much. So this actually looks like just giving people a checklist in one order rather than the other does a very big job. I want to close in a second, but I want to share some brand new results. Literally, I got these last Thursday. They made my day. When you do this kind of research, everything's on the web. You get the results. You get very happy. So here's the results you've seen to date. To the right, your right of that line are new results. One thing we tried was just giving people a pre-checked 70. That is, like we have worked in organ donation, you can pre-check one box. It changes, has a strong effect on what people choose. Here we just pre-checked. That was about 9 months. In our new study, later first actually delayed people's claimed benefit date by 18 months. This is huge. We've tweaked a couple of things about that. And here's early first. And so you can see that early first is the same as control. It means essentially when you give them the early first, that's what they're doing naturally. Okay. Let me summarize where we are. First thing, I'd argue that many Americans are making mistakes by claiming Social Security benefits too early. Identifying those who are making mistakes is really important. There's a couple possibilities. One, which I think is a huge opening, is we actually should customize recommendations for people. We call those smart recommendations and smart defaults. But the other thing we've explored with this checklist is something really important, which we let people apply their own knowledge to the decision. I think that actually has lots of hope. We think what's going to happen there, by the way, is those people who should retire early will actually say, no, none of those reasons for retiring late apply to me, and they will not be affected. So we think that's actually going to have differential, but that's ongoing analysis. We argue that present bias contributes to early claiming, that basically this is actually not just something that works in the laboratory experiments, but actually is worth millions of dollars in people in foregone gains. We can intervene using query theory and preference checklists. And I want to argue these interventions are incredibly practical, particularly the checklist, and inexpensive. Unlike radical overhauls of the Social Security system, it looks like we can change behavior radically just by giving people 2 web pages before they make the choice. Last things I want to say is, does our intervention affect the right people? I'll let you know that hopefully in a week or two. Because we actually have been gathering in that last study information about people's health and to be able to calculate their longevity and other things. We'll actually be able to tell you if we're nudging the right people, so to speak. We're going to try and implement this as a field experiment. This is going to be quite difficult. But a couple of things I want to know. Note, by itself, this won't save Social Security. Why? Well, people claim delaying is actuarially neutral. That if I claim at 70, I get the same, on average, expected amount of money as if I claim at 62. And that turns out to be kind of complicated because different groups, like women, live longer than men, so it would depend a lot on that. Also, we haven't looked at all about healthcare costs. It might be that delaying has increased or decreased healthcare costs. We just don't know. So that's a complicated question. But what could happen is that this could increase consumers' welfare. Consumers could be better off because they're actually using the resources they have more effectively. Finally, I want to point out that Social Security is an annuity. I hadn't realized this, but it's actually an annuity. It's basically a best annuity you can have. It's inflation protected, and it will last, and it's insured essentially by the status of the US government. Now, you may have differ in how much you feel about that, but that's a pretty good annuity. In fact, some people have argued that it would be great if you could buy Social Security units. Of course, the answer is always going to be at what cost, but that's an interesting idea. The annuity paradox is essentially the finding that most people don't buy annuities, but they love Social Security. I find that fascinating. That's a question for further research. If you want more, the paper that describes the first studies is out. There's a reference. You can look it up. Contact me. I'm eric.johnson@columbia.edu. I may have to run because we have a faculty meeting. We're deciding which faculty to hire, but hopefully that will be over by the time I'm done, and I will be spared the pain. But that will be there. The other thing is I teach a course with Steve Zeldis called The Psychology and Economics of Consumer Finance. And it's actually sort of the elevator pitch. It's fintech meets behavioral finance meets consumer behavior. And actually, it's kind of a really fun course. The dates are July 11th to 15th. Among other confirmed guest speakers, the fintech part of this is particularly strong, is Renaud Laplanche, who was the founder of Lending Club. He comes every year. It's great. John Stein, who I'm sure you remember, Paul. We had him in for when we taught the course with Glenn. He founded a company called Betterment. He's Columbia 09, and this is one of the robo-advisors, and they have now, I think, $2 billion under management. And we have Gary Reeder, who's also, I think, 07 EMBA. He was at the CFPB, one of the founding directors, not directors, but founding folks, and he's now working with BlackRock. So the course is very much about this space between behavioral economics, consumer finance, and psychology. Okay, thanks a lot.